Welcome to Personal Tao. Today we're going to talk about being human. A lot of Taoist teachings are centered around teaching how to be a more graceful person. So what does it mean to be a human being? Well, an animal is a living being that lives against instincts. Those instincts are hard-coded over millions of years to be very effective. They're very reactive. So once an animal is born, those instincts don't change. The instincts only change with each generation. So now what's a human being? A human being is an animal that takes its instincts and expands it with stories. Now, because we wrap a story around our instinct, we can change in our life because the story allows us to modify our instinctual behavior. So, an animal is a living being that lives against its instincts, and a human being is an animal that extends its instincts with stories. So let's look at this more carefully. We are Homo sapien, which means we are both an animal and a human being. We both live to instincts and live to our stories. And there are times the stories and instincts collide with each other. And that can create a lot of challenges, a lot of problems. Now, living to a story is an interesting capacity because it allows us to evolve during our lifetime. That is powerful. Now, Homo sapiens, we as a species, have a clock built into us. Every 7 to 9 years, we change our story. And that's really powerful because it means we evolve during our lifetime. Every 7 to 9 years, we can reset our stories. Every 7 to 9 years, we can improve upon our life by fixing our story. That's incredibly powerful. Now, some of those change points are bigger than other change points. So adolescence and midlife transformation are two extremely major change points where we more completely change out our story. And that's really hard because the transformation will rip apart our life in order to recreate it relative to the new stories that we take into our hands. So, one of the traps of being a human being is to get trapped by their story. What happens when you think your story is greater than you? Then you get trapped by it. See, a story is like a piece of clothing. We wear our stories like clothing. We ride our stories like a bicycle. But there's a point where the story becomes more us than we realize, and then we're shaped by the story more than us shaping our own story. That's a challenge. See, I'll give you an example of this truth. Suicide. Suicide isn't a physical affliction, it's an intellectual affliction. In other words, you don't see cats and dogs jumping off a building to end their life because they're living through their instincts. They will push to breathe every last second because they're living to live. But when a person, a human being, gets trapped by the story, then the story can take over. It can make them do things they don't want to do. And then a person can feel trapped by their story to the point where they will commit suicide to end the story. When in fact, all you need to do is change your story. So suicide is an interesting consequence of living through stories, it turns out. The challenge, if you're feeling suicidal, is not to hurt yourself. The challenge becomes, how do I reinvent my story? And that's a powerful truth, because once you realize that, you can start to live a better life again by changing your story. Now, it's important to live our stories because when a person looks at you, they don't see your inner essence. What they look at is your story. So that's an interesting truth. We do need to live to our stories. Now, a lot of Taoist teaching and Buddhist teaching will teach you how to remove stories. We remove the stories which no longer serve us. But we do have to understand and accept we live in society. We play with each other. We live with each other. And to live with each other, we need our stories. Our stories are what kind of bind us together. So there's a kind of an interesting trap where society will define your stories in order to live better, but those stories that we live as a society aren't necessarily better for you as an individual. So and then we're going to have a conflict between our social stories versus our individual story. And that's a challenge. So in Taoism, a lot of Taoist practice is actually story management, because learning how to work with your stories improves how you live a thousandfold. We need our stories so other people can see us. So when someone looks at me, they see Casey. But am I really Casey? No, I'm actually, my essence is very different. My essence is much simpler than that. But if I lose myself in Casey, then I might think I'm someone I'm not. In other words, I could take other people's perception of me, and that can change how I live based on their stories. And again, we do that. We tend to take other people's stories and make them our own. And that can create a lot of challenge for us because lots of times another person's story isn't our story. And that can create a lot of conflict in our life. So it's an easy trap of being a human being to take another person's story and give it energy. Now, stories are all around us. Stories are neither true nor false. They are the way we interact with the world, though. But a story isn't real. A story feels real because we put energy into it. So Casey feels real to me because I put energy into being Casey. But Casey really is a story. I'm so much more than Casey. But we can take other people's stories into us, and that's a trap. So, for instance, if you grow up with another person who doesn't like themselves, you could take that story of them not liking themselves and you could take it onto yourself not to like yourself. You take another person's story and you could actually give it energy and accidentally make it your story. And then later in life you could hurt yourself only because you took another person's story onto yourself. When we grow up with our families, we're taking our family stories and incorporating it into ourselves. And lots of times as we grow up, we take on bad stories from our family or bad stories from our society that can hurt us. So then a lot of counseling, a lot of work we do ends up being, again, story management as we learn to peel back the layers of story that don't serve us anymore. Story management is a very powerful process. If you know people hold on to the stories, if a person's holding on to the story, they become very predictable because you can see how they're acting. So if I see a person who wants to become successful at all costs, I can predict them because I know they'll do everything to succeed. If I see a person whose story is be greedy and make as much money as they can, they're very predictable. So our stories can trap us in their momentum. If the story is, I'm not good because my dad told me I'm not good, that momentum will keep you pushing into hurting yourself. If you release that story, you can then change the way your whole life flows. Now, there's more stories around us than we realize. For instance, right now I'm walking through this park. This park is an artifact of society. Society has come together and it has made this park. But this park doesn't reinforce society, it reinforces us, the people. So, society, interestingly enough, is a story. It doesn't exist, it's not real. It leaves real artifacts behind from our collective actions. But society is just a story. It's an agreed upon story of how we live and interact with each other. So if all the people go away, well, society goes away too. society isn't real. It's merely a manifestation of our shared story. But it's trying to convince us it's real because it's a living being. It lives through our actions. It tries to control us by making us scared, by giving us laws. And we could lose ourselves in that too. So now there's a push-pull between our creation of society and the way we want to live as individuals. If you live with integrity, it changes the way society behaves. Always remember that. Society is rooted in you. You have more power than you realize in helping society change. Now, because society is a mental construct, it tries to teach us that a lot of its values are real, but they're not. And that's a trap. So, for instance, for relationships, we're taught that people are interchangeable. All it takes to make a relationship work is to try hard enough. And that's not true. That's what society teaches us. But the reality is, relationships require chemistry and personal interactions, which define it more than working hard. Working is hard is part of a relationship, but we're not interchangeable. You need chemistry too. But society tricks us into thinking that we can marry anyone, when in fact we need to be patient to find our soulmate. So, again, it depends on what you're looking for and who you are as a person. Some people do really well working with the constructs that society gives them, and other people will resist those constructs and they need a more open path. Again, it comes down to story management. So, learning how to work with your stories is a fundamental part of being a human being. Now, the interesting truth is, we're not the only humans on the planet. Homo sapiens does not have a monopoly of being the only humans. Crows, ravens, some dogs, cats, whales, they all are also have degrees of humanity in them. You have to understand, just because you hold a story doesn't mean you have to speak it out or write it down, though those do help it a little bit. And there are different degrees of being human. So there are living beings who are partially human and partially animal at the same time. If you ever own dogs or cats, you can see every dog or cat has its own balance in how it holds itself. Some dogs and cats are more dog and cat-like and more instinctual, while others will have a layer of story to them. You can see it behind their eyes. They hold themselves with awareness, and they have a way of how they hold themselves to see they acknowledge their own story. So it's in degrees. Even people, Homo sapiens, don't always hold their story. When you fall asleep, the story goes to rest. If you're in a coma, your story fades away. So even Homo sapiens aren't always in their story. Now, it takes a lot of energy to hold a story. And that's another trap. Running our brain is roughly 20% of our caloric input. It takes a lot of energy to run our mind. It takes a lot of energy to run a story, it turns out. So one of the fundamental problems in life is when people get tired, they lose control of their story. They begin to lash out. They begin to attack others. They begin to try to force their way into life because they're too tired to maintain their story. So if you're having a lot of problems in your life, if your story is beginning to break down, oftentimes the first solution is rest, eat well, take care of yourself, exercise. Because if your body isn't in shape, you won't have the energy to maintain your story. So learning how to work with your stories is a very important part of Taoist practice. We learn that the story doesn't drive us, but we drive the story. And that's the difference between being a true human being versus just a normal human being. Not everyone controls their story. A lot of people instead choose to follow the story that they've been given, the one they grew up with, the one the society has given to them. And they'll die to protect that story. There's nothing wrong with that. So not everyone wants to be a true individual. Not everyone wants to be in control of the story. A lot of people will give up their power to fit into a larger story. So in Taoist practice, we teach you the differences between the levels of story that you hold, and it's really important for you to understand where your balance is and how you hold your own story. Now, another truth is we can hold more than one story at once. We could be a father, a son, a teacher. Those are all different stories. We're not limited to only one story. But that's one of the traps of being a human being again. When you try to blend all your stories into a single story. When that happens, we lose details. And that hurts us. I'll give you an example. Say being a good husband is being present with your wife, and being a good father is spending time with your child, and being a good worker is to make lots of money. Now, what happens if I merge those three stories together? Well, it's like a cup. You can't pour all three into a single cup. 2/3 of the story details flow out. Because we have to survive, it becomes very predictable how this all plays out. You have to make money, so you keep, I make lots of money. And then the most important thing after that is, I love my wife. So all of a sudden the two stories re-merge together and it becomes, I love my wife, so I make lots of money. And that's not true at all. You merge several stories together and they became a totally new story in that merging. And you hear that all the time when a partner goes, I don't want you to make money, I want you to be there for me. But the other partner is so tired and so worn out they can only hold one story, so they focus on the survival story of making money, which only pushes apart the relationship. Because the relationship wasn't about making money to begin with. So one of the traps of holding stories is if you hold too many, you could try to merge them together and then lose yourself in the merging. Look at your life. Ask yourself, what stories matter? Ask yourself, what story do you want to live towards in the future? Because every aspect of who you are, you control in how you shape your own story. So, as a human being, you now see the true secret of being a human being. You are a collection of stories. How do you hold those stories with style and grace matter? You don't have to lose yourself in how others tell you to live your story. You can put your own efforts into making your story have style and grace. So this was an introduction to Taoist practice and how to live to your story. If you have a lot of conflict in your life, chances are there are several stories that are trying to interact with each other in different ways. And you can learn how to rewrite those stories so there's no longer conflict, or so you can grow from them in a better way. Take the time to walk through your life, accept which stories are valid, accept which stories make you stronger, release the stories that don't matter. Because remember, even though a story feels real to us, it isn't real. It's just what you put into it that matters. And a lot of our problems are actually stories that we're giving energy to be a problem with. So if you learn to release the story, you also learn to release 90% of the problems of a human life. I hope this was intriguing as a way to look at yourself in a slightly expanded manner. Enjoy exploring your story. Enjoy making your own story. Have a great day and bike along in your life. Namaste.